Welcome to the delightfully named Merseyside village of Port Sunlight, located on the Wirral, just across the River Mersey from Liverpool. Of all the lovely towns and villages on the Wirral, however, Port Sunlight is entirely unique, a model village that was built from nothing in the late 19th century, to give a home to the workers of a brand new factory. But despite its Victorian origins, much of Port Sunlight was deliberately designed in the style of a traditional English village, with mock timber-framed houses and taverns that line the village's wide-open boulevards. We'll take a walk along the fetching streets of Port Sunlight throughout this tour, but we begin at the heart of the village, with the eye-catching Christ Church. One of the newest additions to Port Sunlight, Christ Church was built in 1904, and is one of just two buildings in the village that were funded directly by William Lever, one of the famous Lever brothers who founded Port Sunlight. Situated right in the middle of Port Sunlight, Christ Church was founded as a non-denominational church, intended to allow all the residents of the village to worship inside, creating an important meeting place for the workers of the Lever brothers factory to foster a sense of community. A striking local landmark with its imposing red sandstone exterior, Christ Church is an eye-catching place to visit, and not least for this tomb, which can be found here around the back of the church. This is the tomb of William Lever, the man who funded this church's construction, alongside his wife. William Lever was a major industrialist of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and who established the Lever Brothers Company alongside his brother James. The company, of course, went on to found Port Sunlight, the village that we know today. Established in 1884, Lever Brothers were originally based in the Cheshire town of Warrington, and it was one of the first companies to manufacture soap using vegetable oils rather than the animal fats that had been used for decades beforehand. The Lever Brothers' groundbreaking soap products proved a hit, and by the late 1880s, production in Warrington was skyrocketing, prompting the brothers to build a new, larger factory for their product. But with the prospect of a massive new manufacturing plant with a huge workforce, the Lever Brothers took a keen interest in supporting the welfare of its workers, and so decided that, alongside their new soap factory, they would build a model village with high-quality housing for their employees. As we can see around us, that plan came to fruition with spectacular success, giving birth to a unique village that has all the character of a traditional English community, but has the wide open space to accommodate a modern existence. But why exactly did the Lever Brothers choose to build their factory and model village here? Well, to understand, we need to take a look at a map and see exactly where Port Sunlight is situated. As you can see, Port Sunlight sits on the eastern side of the Wirral Peninsula, today a short drive from Liverpool over the river and from Birkenhead. But before the construction of Port Sunlight began in the late 1880s, this area was nothing more than uninhabited marshland. In the eyes of the Lever Brothers, however, the marshland had real potential, located between the River Mersey and the busy Chester and Birkenhead Railway, while its flat, wide-open landscape would allow for the construction of all the facilities needed for a populous settlement, and then to expand even further should that be needed. The village today is only home to just over 1,000 people, but despite that, it's home to some particularly substantial landmarks, including the beautiful War Memorial here. Placed at the centre point of Port Sunlight in 1921, the memorial features a range of lifelike figures depicting the everyday person defending the country against invasion. Like so much of Port Sunlight, these figures too were a deliberate design of William Lever, who by showcasing the everyday person as a powerful defender of their home, sought to create a strong community spirit among the residents of his village in the devastating aftermath of the First World War, during which time over 500 of his employees had been killed. The Grand Memorial now stands as the central landmark in this beautiful village, with a great view over what you might call Port Sunlight's main boulevard. At the end of these beautifully tended gardens, we can see the Lady Lever Art Gallery, which we'll walk towards now. But as I'm sure you'll have noticed, these grand vistas and wide open boulevards aren't exactly in keeping with William Lever's original vision for Port Sunlight as a traditional style village. Lever was once quoted as saying, "The cottage home is the unit of the nation," and the use of cottage-style buildings in Port Sunlight certainly proves his fascination with the traditional form of housing. The streets surrounding the factory, which we'll visit at the end of our walk, were among the first to be built here, and feature a more traditional style than this central area of Port Sunlight, which represents an important change in approach by William Lever. After the streets surrounding the soap factory were built in the 1880s and 90s, Lever sought to complete his model village by utilising all of the marshland that had been bought. To do this, he organised a competition among students of the architecture and civic design departments at Liverpool University to create a plan for the rest of the village. The winning entry featured these ornate gardens and grand views situated around focal points like the Wirral Memorial and Art Gallery. Lever was so enamoured by the students' design that he cemented this newer part of Port Sunlight as a bastion of so-called axial design, the style that we see around us here. Port Sunlight's grand axial design is one of the reasons that it's so unusual in Britain, a country full of higgledy-piggledy medieval settlements that emerged with relatively little forward planning. But in Port Sunlight, every angle and every blade of grass appears to have been meticulously designed, all with the intent of creating not only a wonderful place to live, but a village with a strong sense of unity, an important factor for William Lever in keeping his workforce happy at the time. Even today, while the village's layout is at first a little jarring if you're from a less deliberately planned area, Port Sunlight is by no means a soulless Lego town, as you might fear. The beautiful gardens, eye-catching architecture, and rich history of the village makes it a wonderful place to explore, complete with a calm, idyllic atmosphere. One of the attractions of visiting Port Sunlight is simply strolling along its beautifully tended streets and admiring the lovely buildings. But the village is also home to this impressive art gallery before us, the Lady Lever. Built in 1922 and of course named for William Lever's wife, the Lady Lever Art Gallery is a magnificent place to visit in Port Sunlight. The gallery features this magnificent opulent exterior, while the interior is complete with a range of majestic, palatial rooms, adorned with valuable artworks from all over the world. The gallery's origins began with William Lever himself, who began collecting art in the late 19th century. Initially, he did this to draw inspiration and material for advertisements for his soap products, but as his collection grew over the years, he developed a strong interest in high art, eventually endowing his collection to this gallery in memory of his wife. Just outside the gallery, meanwhile, stands another focal monument of Port Sunlight's axial design, the Leverhulme Memorial, which dates to 1925. This grand monument features 5 figures representing central influences on William Lever's life and work. At the top of the column is a figure depicting inspiration, while down in front are 4 figures depicting industry, education, charity, and art. Now, we already know how industry and art had an impact on William Lever's life, but what about education and charity? Well, as we mentioned earlier, William Lever developed a strong connection with the students of Liverpool University, who helped to design this part of his model village. In the 1900s, he donated a significant sum of money to the university to develop some of their departments, in the process helping to create the Department of Civic Design, the first university department in the world dedicated to the study of town planning. In his will after his death in 1925, Lever also named a number of charities, while, as we mentioned, the meticulous design of Port Sunlight is a demonstration of how he was driven by creating an idyllic, high-quality home for the many workers at his factory, developing a town that was in stark contrast to the cramped houses and slums of many industrial cities across Britain at the time. Lever's benevolence towards Port Sunlight and its people has left his and his family's name emblazoned over pretty much every landmark you'll find in the village. Although, as we'll speak about a little later on, that same benevolence didn't quite extend to everybody who played a part in the Lever brothers' company, particularly when operations expanded overseas. But in the initial period after the production of the Lever brothers' soap moved from Warrington, everything was based in Port Sunlight. But where exactly does this village get its delightful name from? Well, as you can see from the sky above us today, the local climate certainly wasn't the origin for the village's name. In fact, Port Sunlight was simply named after the Lever brothers' Sunlight soap, the main staple of their business that has been manufactured since 1884 and is still sold around the world today. The building in front of us here is Port Sunlight Museum, which opened in 2006, and which tells the story of the village over the last 130 years. Before the building housed the museum, however, it was Port Sunlight's Girls' Club, one of a number of important locations in what emerged as an impressive and thriving social scene in the village. During its heyday in the early 20th century, Port Sunlight's name was known all over the country, and it was a popular tourist destination for many people. By the early 1910s, tens of thousands of people were coming to visit Port Sunlight every year. Not only tourists, but everybody from intrigued town planners and architects to trade unionists, and even the Prime Minister and King on a couple of occasions. Port Sunlight's many fetching buildings housed a range of activities that proved popular for outsiders, but the village's infrastructure was still always built with locals first and foremost in mind. Here, we're passing by what is today Church Drive Primary School, another grand piece of infrastructure that William Lever was committed to delivering to the highest quality possible. An eye-catching building in and of itself, the school's grandeur is an example of how education was so important to Lever, as we saw depicted on the Leverhulme Memorial a few minutes ago. When it was originally built, the school was designed so that children could keep studying up to the age of 13, 3 years longer than was mandatory at the time, as many children worked most of their lives in factories around the country. Lever believed strongly in the education of Port Sunlight's children to help better the community as a whole, with lessons taught in useful subjects like English, accountancy, science and engineering. But the school was just one way in which Lever sought to foster Port Sunlight as an ideal community. We've already spoken at length about Lever's efforts to create community spirit in the village, but he was arguably most committed to this through the many activities in the village that were paid for by his company. As most, if not all, of the people living in Port Sunlight were employees of Lever, he organised activities to help create a healthy and happy workforce, which he believed would have a big impact on production and profits for his soap company. The problem, however, was that many of these local activities were mandatory for residents, and were just one example of how Lever's view of an ideal society led to some rather intrusive rules for life in the village. Rules that, if broken, could lead to the immediate eviction and sacking of anybody in Port Sunlight. Passing by the point where we started our walk, we'll now make our way into the older part of Port Sunlight that surrounds the original soap factory, which is still occupied even today. The streets surrounding the soap factory are much narrower than the grand central part of the village that we've explored so far, but they're also full of examples of Lever's efforts to create the perfect community situated around his busy factory. At the time when Port Sunlight was being laid out for Lever's workers, the so-called temperance movement was gaining traction among social reformers in Britain. Temperance reformers believed that alcohol was a major cause for much of the poverty that was being seen across the country in the industrial period, and the ideology caught on with William Lever as he built Port Sunlight. Here, we're passing by the Bridge Inn, the village's one and only pub, which was designed to look like a grand traditional tavern that you'd find out in the countryside. But in line with the doctrine of the temperance movement, no alcohol was served inside the Bridge Inn when it opened, much to the dissatisfaction of Lever's workers. After a couple of years, the people of Port Sunlight asked Lever to sell alcohol at the Bridge Inn, and after a vote among the residents of the village, it became permitted, albeit only alongside food and other drinks, to discourage people from simply going to the pub to get drunk. Like many places once gripped by the temperance movement, Port Sunlight's pub is now a perfectly normal inn, where you can buy alcohol to your heart's content. Even so, the Bridge Inn became a popular point in the local community, much like Hulme Hall, which we can see across the road here. Also named after Elizabeth Ellen Hulme, otherwise known as Lady Lever, this building of 1901 was originally designed as a dining room for the ladies of the village. Later on in history, however, it became a typical local venue, which in 1962 hosted a band from up the road in Liverpool, who went by the name The Beatles. The Beatles played 4 times at Hulme Hall through 1962, and their performance here in October of that year was the very first to feature drummer Ringo Starr, after former member Pete Best was sacked from the band. It's also said that the Beatles' very first televised interview took place here at Hulme Hall, a wonderful venue in Port Sunlight that continues to accumulate history as the years go by. We've now made our way into the older part of the village, which was built in the first decade of Port Sunlight's existence around the Lever Brothers factory. Now, the soap that was produced in Port Sunlight was successful because it didn't use heavy animal fats, as had been common beforehand. Sunlight soap was lighter, thanks to its use of vegetable oils, such as palm oil, which was typically sourced from British imperial colonies in West Africa. Throughout the first decades of Sunlight soap's rise to success, Lever used palm oil produced in West Africa, but as the business continued to expand, he began to face difficulties in finding more palm oil plantations for his product. To remedy this, William Lever began looking elsewhere, and in 1911 he signed an agreement with the Belgian government, allowing him to use palm oil from the Belgian Congo, in which the company's base, Leverville, was established. Initially, Lever aimed to make Leverville just as he had made Port Sunlight, with the welfare of workers in mind. Unfortunately, local Congolese workers were disinterested in Lever's offer of some particularly harsh work, so he turned towards the Belgian government, who were already notorious for a brutal regime of forced labour. Lever's operations in the Congo were then carried out almost entirely by forced labour, that was a part of a devastating exploitation of the Congolese that caused millions of deaths, a particularly grisly part of Lever's legacy. At the time, the people living and working in Port Sunlight likely wouldn't have known much about what was going on over in the Congo, as they were occupied with their many local facilities, such as this building, the Lyceum, a social venue built in 1896. The Lyceum is one of the oldest venues that stand in Port Sunlight, and it overlooks one of the village's most fetching open spaces, a small green valley known as the Dell. Crossed by a sturdy Victorian bridge, the Dell is a place that shows us what Port Sunlight would have looked like long before its streets and houses were built. The marshland that once occupied this area was filled with small streams and creeks like the one which flowed through here, on their way to the major river Mersey. The incorporation of the old stream into the landscape of William Lever's planned village is a symbol of how his initial plans for Port Sunlight were based on creating an elegant landscape in the style of a traditional countryside settlement. As we saw earlier, however, axial design would soon take over at the front of Lever's mind, creating a stark contrast between this part of the village and where we began. But just beside the Dell here, we're passing by Bridge Cottage, which is where William Lever himself, the founder of Port Sunlight, lived from 1896 to 1897. Though he owned properties all over the country, later retiring to the Outer Hebrides and Scotland, in the first years of Port Sunlight's existence, Lever decided to live in a moderately humble cottage among his employees, in an effort to show he was a part of their community too. Lever took part in all of Port Sunlight's mandatory social activities, while he also sought to act charitably to the people who worked for him and lived in his village. At Christmas, for example, factory workers were all invited for a party at his manor house in the nearby village of Thornton Hough. Meanwhile, on their birthdays, all the children of Port Sunlight were gifted with a book by Lady Lever herself. So at least in terms of his operations here in Port Sunlight, William Lever certainly spared no expense in creating a community that he saw as idyllic and ideal for his workers. Designed to be easy on the eye, Port Sunlight remains a lovable place even today, and in the 1980s, the village was finally opened up for the first time, with houses able to be sold to people who didn't work for the local company. No longer quite as dominated by the single profession that gave birth to the village, Port Sunlight is a delightful residential village that stands as one of the nicest places to live on the Wirral. The village is a bit of a commuter town too, for people who work over the river in Liverpool, with easy links to the big city by road or by train, with the village's railway station located here, not far from the factory. Before the development of the grand boulevards in the modern centre of the village, this area was the very heart of all the action in Port Sunlight when the village was first built. Here we're passing by a delightful green that sits beside the railway line and a short distance from the original soap factory, which we'll take a look at in a minute. At the foot of the green, meanwhile, stands the Gladstone Theatre, another local venue that stands as a counterpart to Hulme Hall, which we saw earlier. The theatre takes its name from Liverpool-born Prime Minister William Gladstone, who opened the building in between terms in office in 1891. Before it was a theatre, however, this was designed as the dining room for male employees of the Lever Brothers company. The men didn't have far to walk from the factory, which stands here on the southern edge of Port Sunlight. As we've spoken about, the factory was one of the very first places built in Port Sunlight, with construction beginning in 1887. 8 years later, the huge factory was fronted by this ornate stone house, known as Lever House, which today serves as a grand entrance to the factory, and was designed as a real show of the Lever Brothers' growing soap empire. Founded back in 1884, the Lever Brothers' Sunlight soap was the first household product in what became a global empire, belonging to a company that you'll likely have heard of. A sizable amount of the everyday products you'll find on supermarket shelves today were made by Unilever, a major multinational company who still keep a base here in Port Sunlight. The Lever Brothers' Sunlight soap was a roaring success for much of the 20th century, but as they sought to expand the business, there wasn't much greater scope in the world of cleaning products. As such, in 1930, the Lever Brothers merged with a Dutch company known as Margarine Unie, which made food products, giving birth to Unilever, which, as you'll know, makes everything from washing up liquid to ice cream, deodorants, Marmite, and more. Soap making no longer takes place in Port Sunlight, however, having come to a finish in 2001. But as we look at the old soap factory which gave birth to this village, the legacy of Sunlight soap lives on strong today. That brings us to the end of our walk around the delightful and unique village of Port Sunlight. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to taking a trip to Port Sunlight for yourself sometime soon.